This is the oldest Catholic church in the original 13 colonies, and it's probably even one of the oldest Catholic churches east of the Mississippi. It originally was settled in 1640 by William and Temperance Breton, and they had it until 1668, and they sold it then to the Jesuits for a sum of 40,000 pounds of tobacco, which is about $1,700 at the time. Good deal. And so at that point, they were living here, and then they moved the chapel up to here in 1731, and they had built a manor house here in 1720, which is out in front of the current manor house.
We're right by Breton Bay. We're on a peninsula, so we've got the Potomac River, St. Clements Bay, and Breton Bay surrounding us.
From the outside, it looked like a plain meeting house, a big structure. And if you think about it, the Potomac River was the major highway at the time. It was I-95 of our day. Everyone traveled by the river. So if you look at it from the river, it just looked like a big plain meeting house or a barn. They built it so not to bring any attention to them. And then not until later on, when they had more freedom within the governments, that they added, the sacristy was added in 1816, but the vestibule and the choir loft was added in 1767, shortly after the French and Indian War.
Our first, what we call a chapel, was built in 1662. The location of our cemetery is now. And at that time, it was not allowed to be called a church, because the only church that was recognized would have been the Church of England. And then in 1704, we had the Intoleration Act, and that forbade Catholics to worship in public. And prior to that was the Protestant Rebellion. So because of that, Catholics would worship in people's homes. And then it wasn't until 1731 that the current church that we're in now was built. And that was limited. It was not allowed to look like a place for public worship or a Catholic church. So the original 1731 church is what you see right behind me here, the central part. We're in the main part of the church now. As you'll notice, there are no stained glass windows. There used to be years after the original church was built, but when we had the 1984 restoration, they were taken out to restore it closer to the period at that time. You'll find that if you look at photos, early photos of the church and the way it is now, there are some changes, but it has been largely preserved quite well.
The painting was put up in the late 1880s. It was painted by a Jesuit brother, Brother Schroeder. And so he was sent around to do various paintings, and he did quite a few paintings up Georgetown, but he also did it down here. And there's a lot of Catholic symbolism in that painting. If you look in the distance on the left-hand side, there's an island looking back, which is kind of symbolic of St. Clement's Island. The palm trees are unique because St. Francis Xavier had gone to the Orient to be a missionary. He was in India, and then he went to Japan and so forth. So that's the symbolism there. And if you look in the foreground, there are some flowers that are peony flowers, and Brother Schroeder was German. So he put it into the peonies as a flower from Germany. It's also called the Pentecostal flower because it only blooms during the Pentecost season there. And you notice the red stole of St. Francis Xavier is a red color for Pentecost also. And if you notice there, the finger points directly up to the dove.
A little bit about our patron, St. Francis Xavier, is the patron saint of missionaries. And so he's noted for his travels to India and Japan, baptized thousands upon thousands of people. It's said that he could barely lift up his arm at the end of the day from all the baptisms that he used to do. People will ask about the statues that we have in the main sanctuary there. We have the Sacred Heart over here, which is a special devotion that the Jesuits had. As a community, they were very devoted to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. But the other statue is of Saint Therese of Lisieux over here. And the reason why she's there is because years ago, the Pope recognized her as the co-patron of the missions with St. Francis Xavier.
We have two aisles, which is not typical of a Catholic church. Usually there's a center aisle, two on the outside. This is kind of similar to an Anglican church. But you have to remember now, when the Jesuits came over to build this church, they were from England. This is the model they knew, But it also, if someone did stop by and look inside and see things, it would be looking very similar to an Anglican church. In the center of the center section used to be the wood stove that would heat the church.
Love hearing the story about, I think one of the pastors had said that if people could not bring money to support the church, please bring a log for the wood stove to help heat the church. Here we are in the vestibule of the church. This was added later on. The original part of the church was built in 1731. That's right behind me. That's the central part of the church. But this came about in the 1760s. This was added on. When they were doing the restoration of the church that was completed in 1984, they found the bones of 7 Jesuits underneath the floor of the vestibule there. And it's believed that they were most likely hidden there because of the time of persecution.
They were working on the foundations out here, and so they had a story that they were buried here. So they found a layer where there were 3 Jesuits that were interred, and then below it were 4. So obviously there was a time span in between that they would bury them to it. So under the restoration, the diocese at the time took the bones up and reinterred them together up into the cemetery.
And then over here we have a copy of the original deed of St. Francis Xavier Church from William Breton. That's dated 1661.
Right.
The inscription that says that this church was originally built to God's glory in 1731 and restored to his praise in 1984.
The church was in kind of disrepair. The Jesuits had left here in 1868 as being permanently here. They still had Mass here, so there was not a presence of the Jesuits here daily. They were here for Masses, and in some records, they had a Mass here maybe every 2 weeks or so. By the time the diocese took it over, and here, the Mass was said in the church hall when it was built, because it was such bad shape. And before that, they thought the church was built in 1767. But when they did the restoration and they dated the wood, they put it back at 1731.
So this is known as the Priest's Cemetery because we have Jesuits that are buried here right on these grounds.
Jesuits were buried here over the years because this was a sacred ground. And so they were buried around the side of the church there and up into inside the vestibule before the vestibule was built. So they were built in this area here. And there were records indicating of the gentlemen that were buried. And you can see there the listing of all of them that were buried here.
And I think that was erected in 1949?
Yeah, 49 it was. Before that, there was just a cross here representing where the cemetery was.
If you look at where we are, we're kind of in the center of St. Mary's County. But you have to also understand, too, is that the Jesuits, the first colony that they set up was down in St. Mary's City. And then they had a large presence up in Charles County, up at Chapel Point. And if you look at the map, we're about halfway in between those 2 points on the river. So relationships is like a day's sail from St. Mary's City up to here, and a day's sail from St. Francis Xavier up to Chapel Point. So it was kind of a logical place to start off to. And in fact, the Jesuits have tried to start a chapel across from us on Breton Bay and Medley's Neck in the 1640s area, but it didn't work on out. So I think they were looking at this area as a midpoint for their travels up and down the Potomac.
We've got a manor house here on this location where the Jesuits lived for about 100 years. There was 3 manor houses actually on this property. The one that we have here now is the 3rd manor house.
And then in 1789, they built the current manor house. And it was bigger than the original one. They also established a school here. Their first school was in 1653, and it was open to local Catholics, Protestants, and Native Americans to go to school. And then in 1677, they established what they call the School of Humanities here. Again, where young men would come and train, get educated, and move on to either Europe for further training as a Jesuit, or just being locally trained. And that's where the connection is to Georgetown is, that started the concept of doing it. And the Jesuits always wanted to establish a college here in this country as part of their means of educating. If you look around now, there are many Jesuit-based colleges.
The manor house originally had a gabled roof, and if you look up there, you will see the line of the bricks, the difference. That was in 1816. So the original part was started in 1789. It goes on up. The walls are solid brick all the way up to the roof line. The bricks in the bottom, the walls are 1.5 feet thick, and the rest of the walls are 1 foot thick. You have a row on the edge, and then a row on the end. Edge, end, edge. So you can see that point. But above here, look at here. You have a long, short, long, short. So one's an English bond, one's a Flemish bond. There are different types of bonding here. So the building can be used as a teaching tool to people about styles of construction back in the colonial time. The building's unique is that it's 32 by 50, and it's only a 1/4 inch off of being perfectly square. So I think that's amazing that in 1789 they could build a building and that'd be that perfect without modern technologies. The building is a classical Georgian style building, meaning that there's some math to it, meaning that there's a section of 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay? And then on the inside, on each floor, there's a wide central hallway, and then there's 2 rooms on each side. No 2 rooms in the first floor and the other floors are the same size. The walls are offset. That's another characteristic of Georgian style. Right here in these 2 windows here was the library. They had over 500 books in that library to be used by the local community. So it's one of the first libraries in the state of Maryland. It was also the first Catholic school in the original colonies. The woodwork inside is the original 1789 woodwork. In fact, the woodwork on the door is from 1789. The wooden pegs that were used to hold the doors together. So all this is done with wooden pegs. And inside, the main beams inside are wooden pegs also. They had nails, but nails were expensive. And they were handmade, so they use a lot of the joinery was done with wooden pegs. So there are beams in here that run the full length of this house, which is 50 feet, and they are 12 by 12. So you can figure out how massive those are that they got it in there. And they did not have modern machineries to put them in place. It was put in by hard work. Down here, these 2 windows here, this was the kitchen. This was the kitchen for the winter time and so forth. We assumed that they had an outside kitchen too. But this room in here has a brick floor, a big fireplace. There are 9 fireplaces in this place. So when Father said you bring a piece of wood, they needed wood to keep this place warm. So each room was heated by a fireplace. So the first floor, the hallway was used by the Jesuits for their business and so forth, and they had other rooms assigned for the library and so forth. Whereas the upper floors were used as rooms for lodging. And this is the north side here, and about 10 feet in front of this house, right in here, was the 1720 Manor House. And there's documentation that during the Revolutionary War it was used as a recovery hospital. But this is most of the pictures you see are taken from this side. At one time there was a porch on the whole length of this side. If you look at the basement, these window grills are original. In this parking lot here, there were 12 barns and outbuildings in this area and here. They were tore down in the early 1970s. So you have to think of this was a big plantation. It went from where the cemetery was all the way down to the water. And so they had tenant farmers working here. Each farmer would work a certain amount of acreage and then would give part of that share to the Jesuits, and then the Jesuits would take that money and use what they had to do for their education.
Well, we're doing several things. One is that we have a committee working to gather oral histories of some of the parishioners and local people here to capture that memory.
We're looking at the possibility of restoring the Manor House, and I think that's a way certainly that people, in supporting that project, keep the history and the legacy of the Jesuits alive here, as well as what we do here in our own Catholic life and worship.
And people can stop on by as they go down to the park, whatever. We have brochures and we have some displays out there to help explain the Manor House, since we can't go inside at this point.
We have Mass every day at 8 o'clock in the morning, except Tuesday and Saturday. And then we have our weekend Masses as well. And certainly if anybody wants to come and visit and arrange a tour of the church and the grounds, to see the Manor House on the outside, they're welcome to do that as well. They can call the office and we'd be happy to set that up.